Here you see a photograph of a Cossack in German uniform. But who are the Cossacks to begin with? And why did they work together with the Germans? Why did they put on a German uniform to fight for them? In this video, you're going to learn about Cossack collaboration during the Second World War. Stay tuned. Good to have you back on the channel. My name is Stefan. I'm a Dutch history teacher. I make videos about history for you. If you like that, consider subscribing. Hit the notification bell, and if you want to support me, you can do so via Patreon and PayPal. The links are in the description. Communities of Russian Cossacks emerged in the 16th century in southern Russia. There is vagueness when it comes down to the origins of the Cossacks. Let's start with the name. Cossack. Where does it come from? Some authors link it to Kazakh or a Cossack, referring to a Circassian from the northern Caucasus. One author traces the name to a leader from the 10th century whose name was Cossack or Kazakh. Another author thinks the word was taken from a mispronunciation of the Turkish word Kazak, meaning robber. Most historians agree on the mixed ethnic origins of the Cossacks. There is no serious reason for labeling the Cossacks as a separate race of people. According to most writers, Cossack and non-Cossack, the Cossack people are descending from the Turks, Tatars, Russians, Ukrainians, and a multitude of other people who, at some time or another, settled or passed through the invasion route that stretched from Asia to southern Europe. Cossacks were known for their horsemanship and bravery, but also their independent spirit. By the 18th century, the Cossacks had become a distant military caste. They were often deployed to strike down uprisings within the Russian Empire. By 1914, there were 13 Russian Cossack hosts. 6 European, Don, Kuban, Terek, Astrakhan, Ural and Orenburg, 7 Asian, Siberian, Repatriation, Transbaikal, Amur, Ussuri, Yenisei, and Irkutsk. And the Zaporozhian Cossacks, these were Ukrainians. During the First World War, they fought in the Tsarist army. After the Russian Revolution and the Bolshevik takeover, the Cossacks fought on both sides during the Russian Civil War, but mostly in the ranks of the White armies, where they indulged themselves in massacres and atrocities. There were even some short-lived Cossack states, the Kuban People's Republic and the Don Republic. Both were conquered by the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks, they issued a policy of Decossackization, which was continued by Stalin. Needless to say, many Cossacks wanted to get rid of Bolshevism. And then the German armies invaded. It was June 1941 and Operation Barbarossa had begun. Cossack veterans of the Russian Civil War who had fled Russia and settled elsewhere in Europe, these were known as the white émigrés, they reacted positively to the German invasion of the USSR. One of these was Pyotr Krasnov. Actually, this Don Cossack led one of the very first uprisings against the Bolsheviks after they had seized power in Petrograd in October 1917. Eventually, Krasnov fought in the Civil War on the side of the Whites, and when that was failing, he fled Russia and settled in Paris and later in Berlin. He was also delighted to hear that the Germans had taken up arms against the regime he hated so much. As he pledged his allegiance to the Nazi regime in Berlin, he made a statement. "I wish to state to all Cossacks that this war is not against Russia, but against communists, Jews, and their minions who trade in Russian blood." Apart from émigré Cossacks, there were other Cossacks who joined the ranks of the Germans, and these basically formed the bulk of the pro-Axis Cossack formations. These were Soviet POWs. In the first months of Operation Barbarossa, the Germans captured millions and millions of Red Army soldiers. They surrendered themselves as POWs and were hoarded into camps. The conditions in these camps were appalling to say the least, because the Red Army prisoners were barely fed, and as a result of that, millions would die of starvation. When the Germans combed these camps to look for volunteers, many were eager to join the ranks of the Germans, only to get away from these horrifying conditions in the prison camps. But not all former Red Army soldiers were POWs. No, sometimes Cossack troops that fought in the Red Army crossed the lines during battle to side with the Germans. In August 1941, Cossack Major Ivan Kononov, commander of the 436th Rifle Regiment of 155th Rifle Division, crossed over to the Germans and declared that as a Don Cossack he hated Bolshevism, which had destroyed Cossackdom. The Germans used him to recruit Cossack POWs from the camps. He told prisoners of the German successes at the front, which were exaggerated, and promised them better living conditions. In one instance, it was very strange, this occurred mid-October 1941. The Germans, they were approaching the city of Taganrog. Units of the German 14th Panzer Corps reached the river Mias, and one of these units found itself surrounded. The other German units launched an attack to break the encirclement. To their surprise, the 9th Soviet Army was waging a battle behind its own lines. The Soviets were fighting against one of their own units, a Cossack unit that was led by Don Cossack Nikolay Zazarenko. Now, the story of Nikolay Zazarenko is unique to say the least. So, he and his family fled from Russia during the Civil War and settled in Romania. That's where he grew up. He enlisted in the Romanian army and was sent on an espionage mission to the USSR. However, Zazarenko was caught relatively quick, but he managed to escape. And he settled in Taganrog in 1935. There he lived on undetected. Then, it was June 1941, the Germans invaded the USSR. And then, in October, the Germans were approaching the city of Taganrog. Now he and other Cossacks at that moment were working in a factory, and they were mobilized as some kind of militia and sent to the front to aid the Soviet 9th Army. He had obtained the rank of lieutenant, and when he saw the Germans approaching, he launched an attack, but not towards the Germans, no, towards soldiers of the Soviet 9th Army. He soon crossed the lines to the Germans, and the Germans were astonished by such unexpected allies. They allowed Zazarenko in their ranks. And this brings us to the third category of Cossacks that fought for the Germans. And these were basically the Cossacks that were living in the land the Germans conquered. Now, do notice that most able-bodied men by that time were already enlisted in the Red Army. So they were either captured or dead, or further east. So therefore, the Germans only found assistance from men that were really young and really old. Eventually, tens of thousands of Cossacks would fight for the Germans, but exact numbers are hard to determine. And why is that? I mentioned before the Cossacks from these Red Army POW camps that volunteered for the Germans, but also many non-Cossacks were among them that claimed to be Cossack only to get out of these dire conditions in these camps. The very first Cossack units were known as security units, Sicherungsverbände. I also elaborate on these units in my video about Russian collaborators for the Germans, so if you want to know more about that, you can click it right here in the top right corner. These security units were a hodgepodge of all kinds of militia, so there wasn't really a standard organization, and they were basically tasked to guard the rear and to fight against partisans and Red Army stragglers. Early October, Quartermaster Eduard Wagner granted permission to the commanders in the rear to create so-called Cossack hundreds to fight partisans. Soon reality outstripped the bounds of what was allowed and bigger units were set up, such as the Cossack Squadron 102, led by Kononov, who a year later commanded the East Cossack Battalion 102. And a year after that, the unit was expanded into the East Don Cossack Detachment 600. As the Germans liberated Cossack territory, spontaneous Cossack formations arose. In some cases, Soviet authorities were already overthrown before the Germans arrived. The Cossacks made a deal with the Germans. The old Cossack men that were willing to volunteer could serve in transport duties, and the young Cossack men were sent to training school where they received German training and uniforms, and so another unit was created. In April 1942, Hitler officially gave permission for Cossacks to be used in battle, both at the front and in the rear against resistance fighters. It was from that moment that larger Cossack formations saw the light of day. Mid-1943, there were more than 20 Cossack regiments numbering from 400 to 1,000 men. Most of them were former POWs that were captured in the May-July 1942 period. An estimated half of them wasn't Cossack but claimed to be one, only to be freed from the appalling POW camps. In April 1943, the 1st Cossack Division was established in Mława, Poland, which was filled with Red Army POWs and deserters, as well as men from the émigré community. That summer, the unit counted for 12,000 men, and it was commanded by Lieutenant General Helmuth von Pannwitz. The families of these men traveled with them. It was the largest ex-Soviet formation permitted by the Germans. Late September 1944, this unit was transferred to the waffen-ss and thus became redesignated as the 14th Cossack Cavalry Corps. In February 1945, the 25,000-man strong unit was renumbered and now known as the 15th SS Cossack Cavalry Corps. On May 8th, Commander von Pannwitz surrendered to the British 8th Army. Keep watching to learn what became of these men. Let's first take a look at their uniforms and their weapons. I'll start with the 1st Cossack Division. I know there was also these security units, but like I said, it was a hodgepodge of militia and there was no standard organization. The 1st Cossack Division, we see some standardization in the uniforms. These men wore the German field wear uniform. Before that, some wore modified captured uniforms that once belonged to the Dutch army. The Cossack men wore the papaga and the kubanka caps. On these caps there was a cockade, which differed from unit to unit, and a metal eagle and swastika above. On ceremonial occasions, Cossacks wore the traditional Caucasian uniform in different colors. The arm shields were standardized but modified over the course of the war. These were usually worn on the right upper sleeve. Here you see examples which distinguish Don, Kuban, Terek, and Siberian units. Color patches changed over time. Here you see an example of 1942 and here one of 1943. Now, as the Cossack formations were transferred to the Waffen-SS, they did not adopt Waffen-SS uniforms and they remained in Wehrmacht uniform. As for their weapons, well, they used both Soviet and German weaponry. There's a lot of photos where you see the Cossack volunteers with the Soviet submachine gun, the PPSH-41. Where did the Cossacks see combat? Well, the first units, the security units, they fought in the rear against partisans and Red Army stragglers. They could have been a good support for the German frontline troops, but it never came to that. When in April 1943 the 1st Cossack Division was established, von Pannwitz, its commander, wanted to fight on the Eastern Front and liberated the Cossack lands, but there wasn't much to be liberated any longer since the Germans were drawn into their defense. The Cossacks were drawn away from the front line and they were allocated to another troublesome region. I'm talking about Yugoslavia. But this negatively affected the morale of the Cossacks. What has fighting Yugoslav partisans to do with liberating the Cossack homeland? General Pyotr and Krasnov, ancient and venerated former leader of the Cossacks in their resistance to the Reds at the time of the Civil War, was asked to address reassuring words to the men and to hint that this was merely a blooding in preparation for its return to the front line. After this patriotic allocation, the division set off via Czechoslovakia to northern Yugoslavia. The volunteer training and replacement regiment, including the young Cossack school, were removed to France. In Yugoslavia, the Cossack units did terrorize the local population. I also read that some units participated in a massacre of Jews. The Cossack divisions took part in some major offensives against the partisans, such as Operation Russelsprung, the attack on the HQ of the Yugoslav partisans in Bosnia, where Yugoslav partisan leader Tito barely escaped. As the Yugoslav partisans gained the upper hand, the by now known as the 15th Cossack Cavalry Corps, 18,000 men strong, retreated from southern Drava Valley when being pursued by the partisans and the Bulgarians and made its way to Austria to surrender to the British 8th Army. From 1943 to 45 there was also the Cossack settlement, because after the Germans retreated from the Cossack areas after their defeat at Stalingrad, tens of thousands of Cossack civilians fled with them, and they settled in Novorudak in the western part of German-occupied Belarus. As the Red Army advanced in September 1944, they tracked to Tomezzo in northern Italy and set up camp there. They eventually moved into Austria, and so did the Cossack soldiers who came via Yugoslavia. After the surrender, General von Pannwitz repeatedly tried to get assurance that his men, both German and Cossack, would remain in Western captivity. He implored his captors either to utilize the Cossacks as an organized military unit or to hand them over to the Americans. In every instance, in dealing with their captives, the British Army was very correct and polite, but was by and large non-committal about the future of the Cossacks. The traditional response given seemed to say, "Wait until an official decision has been made." But in reality, a decision had already been made at Yalta last February, where Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin had come together to discuss the future of Europe after the war, and it was decided that Soviet citizens needed to be repatriated. As a Soviet draft that was submitted stated, all Soviet citizens liberated by the Allied armies and British subjects liberated by the Red Army will, without delay after their liberation, be separated from enemy prisoners of war and will be maintained separately from them in camps or points of concentration until repatriation. The wishes of the individuals being repatriated were being ignored. And let me tell you this, no Cossack in German ranks that was now in Western captivity wanted to be repatriated to the USSR. The forced repatriations that occurred in May 1945 deserve an episode of its own, but I will address some important points. The German soldiers, they were separated from the Cossack units quickly, since the Germans needed to be repatriated to Germany. Some Cossack units were told they were being allocated by train to Italy. They boarded the trains, but then these trains were redirected and handed over to the Soviet Secret Service, the NKVD. The British, they weren't too keen on using deception. They just wanted to do their job and get it over with. Last minute, someone from the British HQ noted that Soviet citizens who were Soviet citizens after the 1st of September 1939 needed to be repatriated, but not the émigrés, and thus 50 Cossack officers that were distinguished as émigrés were not repatriated. Also, the British refused to hand over the women, the wives and the daughters of the Cossacks. The final and most tragic episode of this chapter occurred in Lienz, in Austria. The Cossacks refused to be repatriated, so the British, they had to use force. Dozens of Cossacks committed suicide, rather falling in the hands of the Soviets. Others tried to flee, but most of them were captured in the following days. The British succeeded in turning over approximately 22,502 Cossacks and Caucasians to the Soviet Union during this period. German General Helmuth von Pannwitz, he remained at the side of his men, and he was also delivered to the USSR. In 1947, he as well as 2 other commanders, Pyotr Krasnov and Andrei Shkuro, were sentenced to death and hanged. Other high-ranking Cossack officers were executed, and low-ranking officers, as well as the rank and file, these men were sent to the gulags, where many of them would perish. Some of them were released after Stalin's death in 1953. Thanks to my patrons, and a special thanks to Haley Barry, Mark Littlehill, Janusz Dojankiewicz, Joanne, Justin Trabell, Peter King, Tanya Dixie, Henry Clarkson, Rob Park, Andrea Martic, and Fernando Lopez Ojeda. If you'd like to know more about Soviet collaboration, well, you're on the right channel, because I got some more episodes for you. You can click right here to learn more about Russian collaboration in World War II, and right here for the episode of the Eastern Legions. Thank you so much for watching. I see you later.